All right. Welcome, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. I am Jennifer Wertkin. I am the director of the Wellfleet Library, and I know many of you. Some of you are new faces. And I'm so glad you can be here with me tonight and our special guest, Adrienne Brodeur, who is going to be discussing her fabulous book, Wild Game, My Mother, Her Lover, and Me, which has a different title in the paperback, which we will discuss because I'm very, very interested in knowing about that. And I'm just thrilled you could be here with us. Before we close, because of COVID, Adrienne was going to come and speak with us in our meeting room. And I'm very glad that in spite of that, we're still able to get together in this format. We're still getting used to this new world, but we are finding ways to be together, to be together, and to still gather and learn and talk and share literature. And as you so aptly say in your book, you know, literature is a very good antidepressant, and I think we're all going through a lot right now. So, yes. Adrienne, I'm just going to introduce her for those of you who are not familiar with her. She has an illustrious literary background. She co-founded with Francis Ford Coppola and edited the National Magazine award-winning Zoetrope All Story. She has served as a judge for the National Book Awards and the National Magazine Award. She was an editor at HMH for many years and currently directs Aspen Words, which bequeaths an annual award of $35,000 for an influential work of fiction. Her father was a veteran New Yorker writer, and her mother was a food and travel writer who published several cookbooks and wrote for the New York Times, among others. So welcome, Adrienne. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. And I am also sad not to be in Wellfleet, which is one of my very favorite towns on Cape Cod. You have to note my little Wellfleet oyster earrings that I'm wearing for this occasion. Bought in Wellfleet at that adorable store. I'm forgetting its name. But I'm really glad I can be here, and I'm really excited that all of you showed up and that we can talk about the book. Perhaps talk about our dysfunctional relationships. And yeah, I'm looking forward to it. So thank you.
Excellent. What drew you to write this book now?
That is a great question. And so for those of you who don't know the very basic premise of the book, it tells this story of this pivotal moment in my life, which happened when I was 14. And then the repercussions of that moment, which really are ongoing, but mostly through my young adult life. And that was, it's set on Cape Cod. It was a night when, as I said, I was 14 years old. My mother woke me up out of a sound sleep with, you know, these 5 words, which were, Ben Souther just kissed me. And Ben Souther wasn't my mother's husband, who was my stepfather at the time. Ben Souther was his best friend. And what I didn't know, of course, at that moment, and it was, you know, I was in my bed, had been sound asleep, was that this was the start of an epic love affair, and that I would become very embroiled in it as the only person who knew about it. And I'd sort of gone to sleep as my mother's daughter that night, and I had woken up, you know, in this very, you know, albeit exciting, as weird as that sounds, but this very sort of seductive grown-up world where I was suddenly her best friend and became sort of unwittingly this co-conspirator in an affair that lasted a very long time. And so, you know, on the one hand, why write about it? I mean, I think it was one of those seminal stories that I was always trying to figure out for much of my life. And my life has been in literature and in the literary world. And I've written shorter things. I've always wanted to write this story. And I think it took me a long time to let the material marinate enough to be honest, and just to sort of get distance and perspective. I don't think I could have done this story justice if I wrote it in my 20s or 30s. I'm 54 now. But it was, I think, one of the impetuses for me to write it, even though I'd done a lot of work on myself, you know, through therapy, and once The Secret came out, through talking to people about it, friends, and also, as you mentioned, through reading. And I think literature is just one of the most phenomenal ways to see, you know, you have lives reflected, that you see a mirror of yourself in different characters, and you see characters figuring out, you know, the pickles that are their lives. And so all those things were very helpful. But I think the thing that really spurred me on to write this book in the way I wrote it, which is in this very direct, sort of straightforward approach as memoir rather than as a novel, or, you know, I thought of it as a romantic comedy at one point in time, believe it or not. But I think it was having children. It was having children and realizing that I didn't want a mother as I'd been mothered, even though my mother had some wonderful and has some wonderful qualities. It was that knowledge, and it was wanting to sort of break this legacy of secrecy and duplicity that existed in my family for many generations. It was not just my mother, you know, to me, in her generation, both my mother and my father's parents had secret families on some level that the children didn't know about. So there was just an ongoing, there was a lot for me to explore as I sought to distance and, you know, hopefully change the future for the next generations.
Wow.
Big answer, sorry.
Yes, no, it is a very big answer. It's a very big answer. And your mother's still living?
My mother is still alive. She's very ill at this point, and at the end of her life. She's in Orleans. We're actually next door neighbors in Orleans for much of the year.
Mm-hmm. Has she read this?
She knew, I mean, she has dementia. And so 5 years ago when I was starting it, and she, you know, this is in no way a tell-all, by the way, you know, The Secret was long out, and at the risk of sort of a spoiler, you know, she does end up with the lover and is married for 20 years. So the shocking part of this is decades old. I think the thing that people didn't necessarily realize in the inner circle of our family was my involvement, and that's really the focus of the book, was how enmeshed I got in all of this. So to answer your question, did she know about it? Yes, I talked to her about it. You know, she knew I was working on it in different ways for much of my life, but she knew that I was very serious about writing it as memoir, and she actually was very helpful, and she was a big chronicler of her own life and gave me access to lots of her material, which was very helpful. But I can't say that in her current state. I read parts of it to her while I was writing it as she was getting sick. And, you know, it was a period of time where my mother had been, her first name's Malabar, by the way, and she fully embodies that name. She is Malabar. But when I was first writing it, and she was much healthier at the time, I would read her sections of it, and she was, I think, losing some of her independence. You know, she wasn't needing care constantly or anything else at that time. But in a weird way, it was very exciting for her to read of these times when she was, you know, a powerful and independent woman, a woman who was, you know, madly in love and going for it. And, you know, cooking, she was a wonderful cook, and she cooked all these elaborate meals and all of that. But at this point, you know, she knows who I am. She's very present, and we can talk about things. So when I see her this, you know, when I get back to the Cape, I'm not on the Cape right now, I will tell her, you know, about my week or so on, but she won't necessarily retain it to the next time. So she has on most days knows that I have a book because we talk about it, but I don't know that it stays with her. And she certainly never read it from beginning to end.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, your feelings towards her in the book, you know, they're, you know, as an adolescent, they're incredibly complex. Every mother-daughter adolescent relationship is. My own mom is on this call right now. We've talked about that many times, but you even as an adult, after the fact, and someone who has dealt with this and dealt with your anger and everything, and now you're writing this book, uh, as a retrospective, you're so you still write about her so caringly and from a place of love, and I guess saying that someone can be deeply flawed, or there can be so many things true at the same time that
That I think is really so much of what I was after, because we're all deeply flawed. We're all fabulous and deeply flawed. And so it's very easy to point to someone like my mother and sort of be like, whew, that's not me. But we all have elements of that, I think. And I would say the other thing is I actually developed a great deal of compassion for my mother in writing this book, because I had to sort of untwist my own narrative. We're all very set on our stories and what happened to us and this and that. And to do this book justice, I certainly didn't want a, mommy dearest. I didn't want, she's all bad and here's my halo and I'm an angel, because it was a very complicated story. And obviously I am entirely, if you will, the victim when I was 14 years old. I mean, that was a situation that was really, definitely boundaryless and confusing. But, one of the things that I felt in the book is you have so much power as the author. And I started at the moment that she woke me up and did this thing that is arguably inappropriate to do. But how different the reader's sympathy would be had I started, earlier in the story when, for instance, my older brother died in her arms. And so she was this incredibly broken person. And then her husband, the man she married after my father, she was tremendously in love with, had 4 strokes in 5 days and became an old man overnight, and was really, she was married to him 8 years before this affair started. And, I'm not saying everyone agrees with this. I'm just saying you can develop compassion. The person she was having an affair with, his wife was in a similar situation where they were both caregiving towards people who were sick, not nearly as healthy or vibrant as they were. So, and she had a very damaging and lonely childhood and so on. And so she actually had wonderful qualities as a mother, despite sort of this very narcissistic side that I show in the book. And I just wanted to make it all gray and not black and white. And I thought that was really important, because I think, there are some people who are sociopaths and just horrible people, but she's not one of them. She's flawed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I do get criticized for being way too forgiving of her. I mean, especially the UK edition. I mean, when I was reading those reviews, they were like, what's wrong with this? And perhaps it's true. Perhaps I just haven't dealt with it enough. Whatever. I mean, I'm, life every day is different, right? We're informed by the moments that happen in our life, and we respond accordingly.
That's interesting.
Oh.
The British.
I know. It was much snarkier than anything I got here. I mean, it was very complimentary of the book, but I was just like, look at that dopey young, I mean, no longer young, but that dopey woman and forgiving her mother.
Right. I'm trying to imagine being, 14 and sort of the seductive feeling of being brought into that world. I mean, in the book, you're describing you're having your own sexual awakening at this time.
Right.
And then your mother wakes you up and shares this with you. And it just must have been like so confusing, but also so exciting.
Well, yeah, I mean, it was all of those things. And of course, people often ask sort of, why did you sign on, or why didn't you just sort of tell her that's ridiculous, or things like that. And I think fundamentally, we only get one childhood, and the one we have is the one that is normal to us. And while I totally understand now how not normal my childhood was, I will say, once again, like, my grandparents had lots of love affair, like, this was something that was sort of normalized in this way. My parents were divorced when I was 4 years old, turning 5. Every time I visited my father, there were just girlfriends and people around, and they would be there for a while. And he was married. Each of my parents were married 3 times. And so, it wasn't like, and also the fact is that it wasn't my father. It wasn't that, my mother was conspiring with me, in an affair with my father. This was, I loved my stepfather. He was a very nice man, but he was sort of like this elderly sick friend we were living with. And so in that way, yeah, it was, and I feel like I'm now defending my mother a bit, which I don't mean to do, but it was very seductive because of how much I loved her and wanted her to be happy, and how happy she was. And she'd always been, I think, a depressed person, or at least the childhood that I remember. She was coming from, I only knew a woman who had lost her firstborn child, who had been unhappily married to my father, and then who'd been devastated by, the strokes of my stepfather. So then to see this suddenly blossoming, happy woman who was in her late 40s, I mean, younger than I am today, madly in love. I just wanted, as a child, I wanted to see my mother happy. And also it felt, thrilling to be in her attention, in her orbit that way, because she was sort of this very charismatic and fabulous person. And, I wasn't the center of her universe until this moment. And then suddenly I had a starring role, and that was interesting for me too.
Right. You mentioned, all the different moving parts for you that must have made this so hard. I mean, and more and more and more as time went on. What do you think were the hardest parts of keeping this secret?
I think the hardest part, and the real toxicity of keeping a big secret, a major secret, is it keeps you from being known. So I think it must be what gay people experience before they come out. I mean, you are hiding such a huge part of your identity. So I was holding this was sort of the defining thing that was going on in my life, unquestionably. Like, it wasn't, I wasn't sneaking off drinking or having my own stuff. It was like I was helping with this thing, and I was doing it for years. And so the fact that I couldn't confide in friends or teachers or a boyfriend or a mentor or anyone like that, I just think it left, I don't think I understood that I wasn't known or being truthful to the people in my world. But that was the hardest part of it. And it wasn't, there's that wonderful book, The Body Keeps the Score. I don't know if you've read that, but it's about how trauma impacts the body. And I mean, I think we've all experienced this in some ways, but, I basically was developing ulcers as this 15 and 16-year-old. And we went to the doctors, and I swear we thought it was because I was working too hard and, was a perfectionist and, everything else. And of course, when I look back on it and I see the repercussions that help me emotionally and physically and in other ways. And it's really taken a long time to unpack a lot of that, because, as I said, I think we also stick to our own narratives. And, one of the things that everyone would have said about my mother and me was just what a wonderful relationship we had and how close we were and what great friends. And of course, what wasn't obvious is, it was unhealthy to have that relationship with my mother.
Mm-hmm. Right. How did you feel when the secret finally came out?
I think I was part terrified and mostly relieved. I mean, I think it was a gift in some ways because I could finally talk about it. I could finally work through it with friends and make sense of it for myself. And that has been, you know, a very long process. It's not like you figure these things out in a week or a month or a year even. So I, you know, as I said, unpacking it took a long time. But, you know, aside from the initial fear, because the stakes had been so high in holding this secret for so long. I mean, of course, what I always felt was like, it could destroy my stepfather. It could destroy Ben Souther's wife. It could destroy these two families. It, you know, it just felt there was so much going on. One of the things that it never occurred to me was that it would destroy my mother, or, you know, like if the secret came out, I you know, I hadn't thought through everything. And so of course, part of it was just worrying what was immediately going to happen. But after that, fear sort of flatlined when, you know, things rolled out as they rolled out. I don't know how many spoilers you want me to reveal or not. Have people read the book or not read it? It'll just help. Raise your hand if you have. So, okay. So then it's most people have in some ways. So yeah, I mean, you know, some of the stuff that I was contending with as it was being revealed. But, it, you know, to the adult person who is me now, there was great relief in being able to actually, it was like exhaling for the first time in, you know, 10 years.
I'm sure. Yikes. So speaking of The Secret,
Yes.
that is now in the title. I mean, I have the hardback, which
And this is the
okay, yeah. So it's my mother. It says Wild Game, My Mother, Her Lover, and Me,
Yeah.
and the paperback is different. It says Wild Game, My Mother, Her Secret, and Me.
right. And what I would say is, I think this is solidly a publishing decision. It was a publishing decision that happened pre the coronavirus. And, you know, I mean, it's really sort of almost a business thing, but for the hardcover, they had certain goals, and that was sort of, I think they wanted to present it as a very literary book. I think they wanted, you know, it to get it got, I mean, knock wood, thank you, like very lovely reviews. It was well received. And then I think for a paperback that's coming out in the summer, they wanted it to be beachy. They wanted it to be, you know, as inoffensive. Not that I think the image on the hardcover was offensive at all, but it was of a girl. It was a more intimate picture. And there was some feeling, I mean, I think in some ways they just want to do new buzzers and bells and see what works. But you typically, and I'm saying this from my publishing background as an editor, you typically in a normal world for a paperback, you're looking to have it placed in channels like Hudson News, which are the bookstores in all the airports. Well, guess what isn't selling books right now? Hudson News, or Target and Costco. And so in that way, you want the whole package to be as sort of widely acceptable and embraced. So it wasn't like I had some change of heart and thought, aha, this is a better subtitle. I actually like the original subtitle better. But, you know, it was a marketing decision and it didn't bother me particularly. So I rolled with it.
Yeah, no, I assumed it was had to do with your publisher. I just was curious about it. That's definitely interesting.
Yeah, and I think it's not uncommon for subtitles to change slightly. I mean,
Right.
very rare for a title to, unless it's associated with a film and then a film has a different title and then you switch the title of the book to the film, which I imagine must be hard. But
Well, the title of the book itself is fabulous. I mean,
thank you. And it's, you know, the double entendre. For those of you who haven't read the book, my mother, as I mentioned, is this astonishing cook, and she had all these cookbooks, and every night of my childhood was a test recipe. So none of the usual fare. I would have killed for a hot dog, but instead, you know, I would come home and there was something with a fancy sauce on it. And when she and Ben Souther got together, and these were couple friends, they wanted to figure out ways to spend time together as couples. And Ben was an avid hunter and fisherman, so they decided to do a wild game cookbook. So that's the wild game piece of it.
Yes. In their wild game. Pretty amazing. So, later on in the book, after you sort of put a lot of the drama and the trauma, you know, in the rear view mirror a little bit, and you start getting your life back together, you really do talk about the power of literature.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, my father had, you know, many girlfriends as I was growing up, and he was married twice, and after my mother, and I feel like he would move on, and I would keep these fabulous women. And one of the most fabulous women in his life was my second stepmother, whose name is Margot in the book, and she owned an independent bookstore in Del Mar, California, and where I lived out in San Diego for several years. And from the very beginning, when I would see her, she would just press these novels into my hand, and they were books. I mean, it was almost like she intuited that I was in trouble, and I really was in trouble in my early and mid 20s. I was sinking into a depression, not really realizing that was happening, and just I had a lot to sort out. And she just started passing these novels to me. And when I think in hindsight what they included, they were, you know, there were some Barbara Kingsolver early books like The Bean Tree. There was Jim Harrison's Dalva. There was Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. And there were all these books that had a young female protagonist who was really trying to figure things out. And I feel like, you know, I didn't even really realize that I was reading, you know, to sort myself out, but I have found reading voraciously sort of one of the most healing things that I've ever done in my life, and I continue to do it. I think there's something about being able to step into another character's life so that I can be, I don't know, in the deep South, in a war-torn Italy, you know, wherever, and experience the life of a different generation or a different person from a different cultural or racial background. And I just think it's so empathy inducing, and it really helped me so much. She was one of the major forces for good in my life.
That's great.
Independent bookstore owners are right up there with librarians, Jennifer.
I would agree. And they're hurting right now.
They are hurting. It is hard, you know, to figure out how to run a bookstore when you basically can't sell books easily. Mm-hmm. And you're up against Amazon.
Yeah. Now, any book purchasing I do these days is through independent bookstores online.
Yeah.
For my personal purchasing. So, for yourself as a mother, how has the experience that you had, how has that informed the way that you do things with your children?
Oh, how hasn't it? I mean, I will say, for one thing, my circumstances are entirely different in that, you know, I consider myself so lucky. I'm very happily married, and I don't know what magic and fairy dust and everything else align for that to happen. I think it's hard work, but I also think there is a lot of luck involved with it. So I have a real partner as a parent, which, you know, my parents were divorced, so they didn't have that in their parenting. I also, you know, I lean towards honesty, you know, at the cost of potentially offending people with regularity. You know, I'm not a rude person, but I really always try to be honest. I try to live a very straightforward life. I try to teach, I think one of the biggest things I try to teach my children is to understand, you know, their flaws as well as their strengths so that they, that they can operate well in the world, and just to be more self-reflective. But it was interesting because when the book came out last October, I actually had a 14-year-old daughter. I mean, what were the chances?
Wow.
And I remember, it's been far, people often ask like, oh, well, you're your mother's age when this happened, or you're older than your mother now or something. And the relationship to my mother and my age is much less interesting to me than having a daughter my age, because a daughter the age I was when this happened. Because I will say, my daughter's spectacular and she's mature and graceful and lovely and all those things, but she is also a child. And it has taken me being an adult to understand how much of a child a 14-year-old still is. Because of course, when I think back to that time, I think I knew what I was doing and I had agency and all this, and you do and you don't. I mean, you really don't. There's such a strong desire to please your parent, or at least there was in my case. There certainly is in my daughter's case. And so I think, I also think of the role as a really sacred one. And, I have my failings and I'm sure they're going to let me know what I've done wrong. And I'm doing my best, as I frankly, I believed my mother did her best and she was better than her incredibly not great mother. That said, I work hard and I'm very thoughtful about how I parent. But, I'm sure I'm getting some things wrong.
So I was wondering if any of you all had any questions.
I actually have a lot to say.
Yeah. Are you Jenny?
I am.
Hi, Jenny.
So Rennie, this might be a little strange, but I don't expect you to
each
remember
other?
me. You and I grew up next to each other when you lived on Ocean Road, but you were much younger than I. So
Heights, yeah.
yeah, so you and Stevie I'm 62.
Okay.
So you're that much younger. And if you think of where you lived and then where the Turners lived right next door to you, we lived right next to them. And so
on the other side of the Turners?
On the other side of the Turners.
Okay, so we share a driveway.
So we didn't share a driveway at all, but we're still there. We still live there. And so we're very close to the heirs. So Mark and Marilyn. So I've heard about you all these years. I knew you as a very little girl, but I remember Malabar quite well.
Did she scare you?
No, she totally intrigued me.
Okay.
So I found her beautiful. I found her exotic. I found her different from the other moms that I knew. So that's one of the memories that I have.
That's so interesting. Here, these are always like the big surprises at moments like these.
So a couple things I want to tell you. I loved your book. My daughter-in-law loved your book. She has a couple questions for you in a moment as well. I thought the way first of all, it's beautifully written. So the story is compelling and we all come from dysfunctional families, but the way you wrote it was so incredible. I plan to buy so many copies to send to all my girlfriends as Christmas presents. But even like your sexual awakening was one of the most real, authentic sexual awakenings I've ever read. I'm an English teacher. I've been teaching English, high school English for 30 plus years. And I just found it really beautiful. So I wanted to tell you, and very authentic. The other thing I wanted to say, I have my little notes here. So one thing I love, if you think back to Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter, there are these moments where Hester thinks about confiding in 7-year-old Pearl. And she ends up not doing that, but she really thinks about it.
Right.
So I can relate, I can relate to why your mother confided in you. I totally can relate that that's dysfunctional, unhealthy, but I also get it. And I love the fact that you are aware that Malabar was flawed, we're all flawed, but that you also recognize the deep love that you have for her and the deep love she had for you and still has for you and on different levels. And I think it's one of the most important takeaways for everybody on this Zoom is that we all are flawed. We all do the best we can as parents. You know, I have 30-year-old children. I do the best I can, but wow, do I get it right all the time? Not at all. And I just think that's one of the really important messages from your story. So
thank you so much for saying that, because I just really appreciate it.
yeah, well, thank you. Do you want to ask questions?
Oh, I did have questions. Throughout reading this book and now hearing you speak, I think my biggest question is, do you ever wish that your mother hadn't told you?
You know,
It's a great question.
it is such a great question, and it is so impossible to answer, of course, because it's not like it's one of those before and after moments where there's, you know, an incident like, oh my God, there was a car crash and then I could never walk. Have I thought about what my life would be like had I not had that car crash? Which I would say 100% yes. But this was like my whole life. This wasn't like a moment. I can't even imagine my life without this moment, because it was a moment that turned into a decade, that turned into, you know, another. And so it's really, it's almost impossible for me to conceive of it and still recognize myself and my mother in that. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's
Makes perfect sense, actually.
yeah, it's sort of almost too big to imagine, to like, it would be like, I don't know. It's hard.
Yeah, of course. And I think lives, I think as a young adult, I find myself always looking back at memories or events in my life and being like, if that hadn't happened, I wouldn't be here. Like I wouldn't have done all these different things in my life. So to imagine the opposite is very difficult, but I'm always curious, having read the book, having now heard you speak, what that was.
No, and I agree. Like that, do you remember that movie Sliding Doors? It's literally, in one part of the movie, you're seeing these two parts of the movie. One part, she gets through these doors of the train before it takes off.
Yes.
And this entire, then the time she doesn't, she goes home and she finds her husband in bed with someone else or something like that. I have that moment all the time, like, oh my God, if I didn't do this, I wouldn't have met my husband, and then what would have happened? Or if I didn't do that. But this doesn't feel like a moment so much as like my whole childhood.
Yeah, of course. And I guess like twofold to that question is, what if your stepfather at the time hadn't gotten ill? Do you think that your mother and Ben would have started their affair?
Well, of course, impossible to know. But no, I actually think my mother was terribly in love with the Charles character. And that might, you know, for people who have, you know, different values or religious backgrounds or anything else, you know, think that, well, that's, if you're so in love, then, you know, marriage is marriage and you stick it out forever and so on. So I can't give an explanation for that, but I do feel like had he been the healthy person she'd fallen in love with, I kind of doubt it, but I don't know.
And last, to pin it all together, reading this book and being on Nauset Beach and kind of being in and amongst it all, we've been here in Cape Cod for now 2 months due to COVID, thankful for it in a way, blessings in disguise. It was thrilling and wonderful and joyous to read.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And I wanted to say to Jenny, the one other moment that happened like this and why I asked if my mother intimidated you was I had this event last winter in Providence where a woman showed up who I hadn't seen in, you know, a bazillion years, but we were best friends as kindergarten through 3rd grade. And she shows up and I'm giving this little talk and I'm talking about Malabar. And she actually said, I don't know if I can say a swear word.
Yeah.
Okay. She has said, your mother scared the shit out of me. And it was, you know, my childhood best friend. And she talked about a cereal aisle showdown that happened in the A&P. Do you remember the old A&P?
I just told my children all about the A&P.
My friend, as it only happened in the 1970s, it was like put on a bus from New York City to come visit me on Cape Cod by herself. For whatever reasons, I wasn't there. So my mother picks her up, Malabar just picks her up, and they go to the A&P. And my mom's like, what cereal do you want? And apparently my friend said something that was not acceptable, which must have been Fruit Loops or something.
Right.
The two of them were just like, you know, this little 7-year-old's looking up at her and like, I want this. And my mother's just like, no.
What age were you when you moved away from Ocean Road? Do you remember?
I think my mom was I was 13. It was just a year or so before this started when maybe 12 or 13 she bought the property on Tonsett Road.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I actually I drove my daughter-in-law by the property because she wanted to see where, Mark showed me where it was. I knew Stevie had built the house, but I didn't know that you and Malabar were right there. So we actually did a little field trip
Nice.
this week.
I officially feel stalked.
We saw all the houses on the Cape.
Yeah. Well, only because Marilyn and Mark air.
I love Marilyn. I saw her the last time I saw her was last summer when I just took a walk by.
Yeah, you must see her again. She talks about you all the time.
I'll send her a note. I've been scared to visit anyone of a certain.
I think they're very comfortable
because we're next door. We just go and stand
in their lawn.
In their lawn. So you can stand in the lawn right there, right behind actually where you used to live. And we have lots of conversations with her, and she's very comfortable with that. But I think if you want to see her, I think it's kind of important to do that.
I will swing by. Thanks. Sorry for getting that personal, everyone. We'll get back.
Guys. Does anybody else have any questions or comments?
I do, but you can't see me. So
Fine.
my name's Beryl. I love the book, Adrienne, and I'm also writing a memoir, and I want to ask you because there are some similarities. How did you deal with the guilt about writing about your mother?
Oh,
Did you have any guilt?
oh God, yes. I mean, and especially when she got very sick, and people would ask me if I was sort of relieved that she had dementia, so it wouldn't be such a big conversation. And I was like, oh my God, who do these people think I am? Like, no, there's no relief in anyone ever having dementia. I think the biggest thing that assuaged my guilt, and the guilt is intermittent. I mean, I can feel a lot of guilt for someone who's like not been raised Jewish or Catholic. I carry a load of it around. But I think, it's my story and my truth. I think so long as you're not trying to settle any scores, so long as you're as hard on yourself, which I very much tried to be as I was on anyone else, I was trying to really talk about what happened and talk about how I got the reins back on my own life, much more than saying, look at what she did, it was really bad.
Right.
And one of the books that really helped me, have you read Vivian Gornick's The Situation and the Story?
No.
It's
Okay, I'm gonna write that down.
It's a book that's about, I mean, it's not an easy book, but it's a book about how to write narrative nonfiction. And there was this line in that book that I swear I taped on my computer, and it said, in order for the drama to deepen, you must show the loneliness of the monster and the cunning of the innocent. And I remember thinking, that's how to make it okay. That's to show that I was getting something out of this. I mean, I was really,
Right.
for years I was, and then the part that fascinated me most wasn't the early part when arguably I wasn't. I was sort of being manipulated, but there were many years when I leaned in when I could have leaned out. And what was that about? And so and I hurt people in the process. And so I really wanted to examine that as well. And I think, I can't say you won't feel guilt because it's hard, and different things come up at different moments, and anxiety and other stuff. But I didn't say anything that was untrue, and I didn't say, I don't think my mother would have, she might not have liked the book necessarily. I don't know. She might have liked it. But she wouldn't have felt that I had done anything to slander her or to exaggerate or create a story out of it. I think she would have pretty much been nodding her head and said, really, do you have to tell that part or something? But
Right. Yeah, that's the dilemma. I know about exposing their truths.
well,
You mentioned a book before. I just want to ask you the one about trauma. What was the name of that one again?
The Body Keeps the Score.
Okay.
Do you have the last name, Jennifer? It's like that Bender something or other. It's like,
I'll put it in the chat.
name.
Okay.
It's an excellent book. You'll probably be able to find it no problem.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
But the other thing I was going to say, but I think I forgot it because that's the state of life I'm in.
When I said about exposing,
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing to do is write it all down and then edit back. You know, I mean, I
Right.
think you might just need to get it all out there. And then, you know, part of writing memoir is it's not telling everything. It's shaping and crafting a story too. And I think people forget that there's an art to it. I mean, I got asked recently just sort of about how you decide what to leave in and what to leave out. I mean, it's, you know, that people think the whole story, my whole childhood is there is nuts. I mean, it's just like such a small piece of it. And so, you know, write what you have to write and then see if it's actually, you know, supporting the story as you need it. And if it's not essential, you don't need to include anything that you think is unnecessarily hurtful.
that's really helpful. Thank you so much.
No problem.
Anybody else? Any last comments or anything? I want to know what happens to the necklace.
So,
I love that everyone, yeah, no, that was the unexpected
cliffhanger.
surprise question that everyone has of the necklace. And I actually have a piece coming out in the Boston Globe, I think the day after tomorrow, about the necklace.
Oh, okay.
But what I'll tell you about the necklace is, you know, no surprise. It is not, it's, you know, valuable. It's certainly the nicest piece of jewelry I'll never wear. But it is, you know, my children aren't going to go through college
No.
the proceeds of me selling it. It took on this mythical proportion for her, I think, because who else is from, does anyone else have divorced parents here? No. Wow, what a unique group. Well, what I was going to say is anyone who's had divorced parents, you harbor a secret fantasy, even though you know that they're not right together, that they will get back together. And my mother actually witnessed her father down on bended knee proposing to her mother for a second time. Like, you know, so she got the dream, and part of the dream was the presentation of this necklace. So I think it always spun out of control as this wildly symbolic thing that meant love, but it also meant money, because when they were married, when her father was part of her family, they had wealth, and when he was gone, they really struggled, and her mother was alcoholic, and it was just it was a very confusing thing. So my only other thing to say is thank you all so much, obviously, for coming and for reading the book and for spreading the word. And if any of you have spare time, I would greatly appreciate it if you would read it, if you would rate and review it on Amazon or Goodreads, because as the paperback's coming out, these algorithms unfortunately make a difference, and it would mean a lot to me. And Jenny, I'm going to find you someday. I'm just going to show up on your doorstep.
Oh no, we're going out for drinks. It's going to happen, even in Marilyn's backyard. I have a question for you. Should I buy the hardback or what's better for you?
Paperback at this point.
I should buy paperbacks as a Christmas.
Want to is good, but the paperback just published this week, so that's what sort of everyone's paying attention to.
And last thing I'll say, again, because I read a lot of memoir when I teach, Gail Siebold, if you've read her, did you ever read Lucky?
Yeah, Alice Siebold.
Alice, sorry. Yes, Alice Siebold, sorry. Yes. So I haven't read, I think her memoir, Lucky, is one of the most incredible memoirs I've ever read. Yours is right up there. So I just wanted to say that as a closing for me, at least. It was really that remarkable. So thank you.
Thank you. And thank you so much for coming here and being with us and sharing your stunning memoir. It was wonderful. I look forward to a day when we can open our library up again and maybe see you in here.
I would be happy to come wearing my oyster earrings.
I would love that. Okay.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much. Have a great night.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.